So before I jump into the findings of the review, I just thought I'd give a very brief overview of what's happening in terms of carbon sequestration in grazing systems. So obviously at first we've got those livestock consuming the biomass, which reduces the amount of organic material that's available to be cycled back into the soil. But this is also changing the plant species composition of that pasture and potentially also those pasture growth rates. And it's also changing the way plants are allocating resources to their shoots versus the root growth. And we know that the roots and the root exudates are a significant contributor to the development of soil organic carbon. Movement of livestock over the landscape is also creating compaction, so that's reducing soil porosity and water infiltration. And the breakdown of the litter at the soil surface is also exposing that soil to greater fluctuations in soil temperature. And so this all contributes to both reduced plant production and root production, but also potentially reduced microbial activity. Dung and urine is contributing soil nitrogen to the soil. Nitrogen is important for the stability of carbon, but also for the plant growth and also for that microbial activity again. And where grazing is reducing ground cover, you're then losing carbon from the system as the soil is removed, but also through the soil being exposed to the atmosphere also. So through grazing management, we're aiming to try and enhance these positive drivers of carbon sequestration and reduce those potential negative effects of livestock. And they're some of the key factors that we've looked at through our review. So we undertook a review of all the published literature in Australia that has examined the effect of grazing management on soil organic carbon. We found 30 studies in total that have looked at this. The majority of those papers looked at either comparing grazing intensities, so different stocking rates, or different grazing strategies, so comparing continuous with rotational grazing, for example. The location of those sites are shown in the blue dots on that map there. Jumping into the results of that review, of the studies that looked at grazing intensity, the majority of studies didn't report any significant effect of different stocking rates on the amount of soil organic carbon. 3 of the studies did report a negative effect of increasing grazing intensity on soil carbon. The results of the actual meta-analysis component are shown in these graphs here. They're probably a little bit complicated to understand if you're not familiar with these types of analyses, but essentially what we're looking at in this bottom graph, that black dot represents the mean of all the studies, and that horizontal bar either side represents that 95% confidence interval, so the variation amongst those studies. The further to the left of that graph that dot might fall would indicate that carbon levels are greater under that lower intensity grazing system. But we can see that that dot is fairly close to that 0 vertical line there with that horizontal bar, error bar overlapping, indicating no significant difference. The graph on the right, the colourful graph, just breaks down those grazing comparisons a bit further. So in the blue, we're comparing a moderate to a high intensity system. In the green, a low to a moderate, and then in the red, a low to a high. Each of the points on that graph represents a different comparison reported in the papers. And again, we can see they're sort of clustered around that 0 mark, representing no significant difference. We did think that by breaking it down into these comparisons, we might begin to see some of those differences, comparing a low versus high, for example, but that wasn't the case. The results of grazing strategy on carbon were fairly similar again. So the majority of those papers also did not report any difference in grazing management on carbon. Where there was a difference, 1 of those papers reported an increase and 2 reported a decrease in carbon under rotational management. And you can see the result of the mean of those studies again in that graph on the bottom. The graph on the right again breaks those down into different types of rotational systems. So in the blue, we're looking at seasonal grazing systems, and there wasn't many papers that actually looked at this in Australia. In the green, comparing low or moderate intensity rotational systems, and in the red, comparing higher intensity rotational systems. So systems where livestock are rotated through more than 10 paddocks. So we also examined some of those other variables that are responsible for potentially increasing carbon in grazing systems. So things like the plant growth rate, herbage mass and ground cover, as well as some of those co-benefits around animal production. So we did find that herbage mass and ground cover were both greater under those lower intensity grazing systems. and under those rotational grazing systems. There wasn't any effective plant growth rate, but we also acknowledge that there hasn't been a lot of research in Australia that's quantified this, and there are some examples in New South Wales where grazing management has been shown to benefit plant growth rate, so not necessarily discarding that. In terms of livestock weight, that was greater under a lower grazing intensity. There was no significant difference with the continuous versus rotational system. Not shown here, but some other reviews that I've done have also been able to show a greater livestock production per hectare under rotational management. There weren't a lot of studies in Australia that we found that have actually examined the effects of grazing management on below ground biomass and root production. Some of those studies did show a lower root biomass with higher stocking rates, but generally the results are a bit inconclusive at this stage. So why hasn't the scientific literature been able to detect these increases in soil carbon under grazing management, despite some of the drivers of carbon being favoured through these management systems? There's a few different reasons. One of those is the variability of carbon through the landscape and across paddocks, for example. Even at short distances, if you sample at one point, it might return a totally different value to, say, 10 metres away. So this variability just makes it difficult to detect statistically significant changes. And it also means that when we return for sampling, we may be getting different values each time, which just contributes to more variability there. We also see some temporal variability with seasons and as a result of rainfall across time, for example. This is demonstrated in the results of a trial that Warwick Badgeree managed at Condo, a cropping and grazing trial, and the results of that are shown in this graph here. And we see over the first 10 years of that trial that soil carbon levels increased across all treatments over the first 10 years. And by 2012, carbon was slightly higher under the perennial pasture treatment relative to those cropping treatments. But at the following sampling period in 2015, all of the treatments had dropped back down to the initial carbon level or even below that initial carbon level. Now, that difference in that benefit for that perennial pasture treatment was still evident at that time, but this just demonstrates that sometimes those environmental fluctuations can have greater variability than the actual management effect. Thirdly is just also that with pasture improvement and improvement in soil condition, this can also lead to an increase in microbial populations and that cycling of carbon through the systems. And so while you might be improving that soil and pasture health, you may not necessarily increase your soil organic carbon levels. This graph just again represents some of that temporal variability. This is some data from another trial that Warwick's managing at Orange. Not to get caught up in the different treatments, essentially we're looking at different stocking rates and different rotational grazing systems. But I've highlighted in the red boxes there the continuous grazing treatments and in the blue the rotational grazing treatments. And we can see again that over the first 10 years of that trial, soil carbon has increased over time in all of those treatments, and there was no significant effect of stocking rate or rotational grazing. But again, we saw that at the sampling last year, carbon levels had dropped again under both the continuous and the rotational grazing system. So I guess this just demonstrates the importance of sampling carbon over a longer term period and taking multiple measurements over that time to try and understand that window of variability. And I guess the goal is that at future samplings, that window of variability will continue to increase. I just wanted to include here also some results of another recent review by Beverly Henry, just to demonstrate some other options we have in these pasture grazing systems to sequester soil carbon. So there's things like converting a crop to a pasture, sowing more productive grasses or legumes, and removing livestock altogether from the system, which have been shown to have a positive effect on soil carbon sequestration in Australia. This review also found minimal effect of stocking rate or strategy on soil carbon, but that also prolonged high stocking can lead to a net loss in carbon. So in terms of what might be required to offset emissions, I've just included here two separate case studies from contrasting locations. to demonstrate what might be required. So on the left is a 1,200 hectare property from Victoria, and on the right a 22,000 hectare property from Cobar. Both of these properties have similar emissions profiles across their whole farm at around 2,500 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. And the offsets required are presented slightly differently for each. So the property in Victoria would require around 0.57 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year to be sequestered in order to fully offset those emissions. Now, practices like soil fertilisation and pasture improvement may go some way towards meeting this offset, but this may be difficult to sustain over the long term, and I can talk a bit more about that in the next slide. The property at Cobar would require an increase of soil carbon from around 0.53% to 0.58% over a 25-year period, which is about the length of the carbon project. Now, this is only a very small increase, only about 0.05% increase in carbon that's required over that amount of time, but it's also important to keep in mind that it is difficult to achieve that down to that 100 centimetre depth in the profile. It's also a very small amount to be able to record in the labs, and it's also within that magnitude of variability in the landscape, so this can be difficult to measure as well. A couple of other points, along with that temporal variability and that difficulty measuring very small changes in these heterogeneous environments, is also just the fact that over time, soil carbon sequestration reaches an equilibrium. So we see that in areas that already have high levels of soil organic carbon, it can be difficult for practices to then increase that further. It also means that over time, the rate of sequestration eventually begins to slow as that carbon level reaches that equilibrium. And it's also important to keep in mind that the management that's implemented needs to be implemented in perpetuity. So if you're beginning to fertilise, you need to maintain that fertilisation regime into the future. Studies have shown that when you stop fertilising, the carbon levels will begin to decrease again. So, just wrapping up, I guess there hasn't been a lot of research in Australia to show or to demonstrate that link between grazing management and soil carbon. But the general consensus is that management that aims to increase the plant growth rate and biomass, change composition towards desirable species like perennial C4 grasses or legumes, increase below-ground biomass, reduce erosion and promote microbiology to increase carbon is the goal. There's a lot of reasons, and some of that we've touched on today, around why the research hasn't been able to show this increase in carbon. But where we're most likely to see those improvements are where you're starting from a degraded condition or with change in land management and pasture improvement. But this isn't to discourage you from adopting these new management practices. There's a lot of co-benefits to adopting improved grazing management, profitability, sustainability. And I guess the key message is to manage for those other outcomes, and if carbon is a co-benefit to that, then that's great, but don't make it your focus, perhaps. So, I've got a reminder that I had to print fact sheets. But if you'd like, I think included in your booklet and also at the back, there's a fact sheet just on the results of that meta-analysis. And I've also included at the back near the camera a couple of case studies from the Moseley family at Ediwanda near Cobar and the White family near Wentworth, just on their emissions accounting and carbon offsetting. If you'd like further information on the meta-analysis, you can access it there, and also just acknowledging all the co-authors that contributed to that paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah.